As Basarab Leota and Radu fought for control over Wallachia, the relationship between the heads of Moldavia and the Ottoman Empire was utterly falling apart. To make the situation even more complicated, in the chaos, Basarab had turned his back on his biggest supporter in Stefan. Once established on the Wallachian throne, Basarab had caved under the pressure of the Ottoman Sultan, essentially agreeing to vassalship under Mehmed as opposed to Stefan and his allies. Tensions were building, and war was nearing. Stefan, knowing that it was only a matter of time before he would again be facing off with the Ottomans and Wallachians, began to enlist support from his fellow Christians. His effort reached all the way to the Pope himself, but the aid he actually received was less impressive than he had aimed for. Both Hungary and Poland, very likely due to their proximity to Moldavia and the dangers they would face if Stefan were to lose, offered support in the form of troops. The kings of both neighboring countries gave around 2,000 men to assist the Moldavian cause, in great contrast to the 5,000 Siki men that Stefan himself was able to win over. The Moldavian army alone numbered around 40,000 men, showing clearly the reluctance with which Stefan's Hungarian and Polish allies wished to truly join his fight. And with this, the Moldavians would thus be greatly outnumbered. The Ottoman cavalrymen numbered around 30,000, with the entirety of the invading force coming to at least 60,000, though some estimates guess it was over 100,000. Furthermore, Basarab Leota had now fully invested himself in his newfound alliance with Mehmed, and subsequently offered another 17,000 soldiers to join those under Hadim Suleiman Pasha at Mehmed's orders. With each army established, the clock ticked ever closer to the moment of battle. By the time Suleiman Pasha's force had arrived in Moldavia, Stefan had already been preparing for their arrival. Much like other military geniuses of his time, the Moldavian prince enacted a combined policy of scorched earth and tactical sabotage. Wells were poisoned, and any potential food or supplies left behind were burned and destroyed, leaving the already tired Ottomans after their long journey in an even more difficult position. Guerrilla attacks followed, and it seems that Stefan and his men were off to a good start. The goal was to lure the Ottoman forces near Vaslui, an area where an innocent teenage Stefan had stood his ground alongside his older cousin, Vlad Dracula. He knew this battlefield like the back of his hand, and was certain that it would prove advantageous for his own men. The marshy valley the voivode aimed to utilize was engulfed by forested hills, and the worn-out invaders would struggle to march through the unideal terrain. Even just to reach the full extent of the Moldavian troops, the Ottomans would have to cross the brittle Podul Inalt over the Barlad River, a bridge that could scarcely support the crossing of an army. Nevertheless, Suleiman Pasha led his men forth, and Stefan readied his. Thick fog blanketed the valley and its surroundings. Moldavian archers, cavalry, and cannons were peppered throughout it. The Ottomans were close, but caught no sight of the defenders. Moving through nearly non-existent visibility, a portion of the Moldavian army and its Siki allies were accompanied by a handful of musicians as they marched toward the center of the wet valley. On cue, the musicians began to play their instruments, the sound of drums and bugles startling Suleiman Pasha and his men as they scrambled to catch a glimpse of their enemies through the thick fog. Unable to do so, the Ottomans assumed that in the direction of the instruments, they would find the whole of Stefan's forces. This was, of course, not the case at all. Stefan was more competent than to throw all of his eggs in one basket, and he in fact had quite a different plan in mind. As the Ottoman forces neared, Moldavian archery and artillery fire began. Cavalrymen came face to face, and in a short amount of time, the battle was in full swing. At some point, the bridge crumbled under the weight of Ottoman cavalry, and the rest of Suleiman's efforts weren't faring much better. By now, Stefan was ordering the engagement of his remaining forces, and the valley was suddenly flooded with Moldavian defenders. Chaos erupted on the Ottoman side, and it wasn't long before Suleiman Pasha ordered his men into a hurried retreat. Stefan and his defenders chased their fleeing invaders for days, racking up the total Ottoman casualties by thousands. The end result reaching over 40,000. The Wallachian troops, who had been alleged allies of Suleiman Pasha's side, left the battlefield without a single engagement, with Basarab Laiota abruptly deciding to switch alliances yet again. Basarab Laiota furthermore shunned any remaining Ottomans from his own lands, and with that, the Battle of Vaslui had ended. This victory would be viewed as one of the greatest triumphs in European history. Stefan had been wildly outnumbered and with limited external support, and yet through ingenuity and military aptitude, he had won nevertheless. Despite withholding actual support for Stefan, Pope Sixtus named him an Adlita of Christ in response to his fearless efforts against the Ottomans. Still, the Poles and Hungarians too failed to provide further aid in spite of Stefan's ability to prove his skill set against their shared enemy. And with a furious Mehmed now plotting his revenge, Stefan would likely need it. Amassing minimal assistance from those who could provide the most, Stefan decided to try a new strategy. Having become aware of Basarab Laiuta's early endorsement of the Ottoman war efforts, the Prince of Moldavia was ready yet again to make a swap under the Wallachian throne. But this time, he was going back to an old friend. A cousin, to be precise. Vlad III Dracula, whose life had deteriorated quite tragically after he was forced to face Stefan and the Ottomans at once, had been imprisoned following a betrayal by Matthias Corvinus back in 1462. Now, 13 years later, Stefan reached out to the Hungarian king with an unusual request. He wanted Vlad freed. With no one left he could comfortably rely on, Stefan knew that his cousin was his only hope of retaking Wallachia and standing up to the Ottoman Empire. Vlad in his own life had been riotously unwavering in his opposition to Sultan Mehmed, and if Stefan could win his forgiveness, the pair would be a formidable defense unit for the whole of Eastern Europe. And though Corvinus at first refused to support the cousins invading Wallachia together, he did agree to let his prisoner go. How they got back on the same page has been lost to history, but after his return to society, Vlad rapidly restored his relationship with Stefan. The duo agreed to stand by one another and unify the efforts of their principalities, making Moldavia and Wallachia friendly neighbors once more. All that was left now was to kick Basarab Laiota, voivode of Wallachia, to the curb. Unfortunately, still lacking support from the Hungarian king for a war with Wallachia, Stefan was forced to put his plan with Vlad on pause. In the meantime, the Ottomans had been busy wreaking havoc in Crimea and the Principality of Theodoro, something the Moldavian ruler was staunchly opposed to, and thus earned himself further support from the Venetians. Mehmed himself, at this time, was also preparing for another invasion of Moldavia, which he launched in short order. With the help of Laiota yet again and Crimean Tartars, the Sultan came back with a spirit of retribution, hoping to once and for all settle the score after his defeat in Vaslui. By the summer of 1476, Stefan and Mehmed were locked in battle at Valia Alba, and while home field advantage seemed to at first aid the Moldavians, favor quickly turned. The Ottomans, rallied by their leader, brutally massacred Stefan's defenders before the battle was over. It's said that the ground was littered with dead bodies, and even Mehmed's army lost many good men. Stefan himself was soon forced to retreat if he wished not to join his men on the ground beneath his feet. He escaped possibly as far as Poland as the Ottomans pushed forward to take more Moldavian territory. Mehmed's success after the Battle of Valia Alba was less impressive, and soon faced with an outbreak of disease and Stefan's return alongside an army led by Stefan V Bathory, the Ottomans had no choice but to pull out of Moldavia, at last giving Stefan the chance to once more look to his plan involving Wallachia and Vlad Dracula. With Moldavia temporarily at peace yet again, the voivode moved to solidify his loyalty to Matthias Corvinus, anticipating receiving approval for his invasion plan in exchange, and luckily for Stefan, he was right. With the go-ahead from the King of Hungary himself, Vlad Dracula and Stefan of Moldavia laid siege to Wallachia. By the end of the year, Basarab Leota, once Stefan's favored ruler and protege, was on the run, and Vlad III Dracula, after over a decade of unjust imprisonment, was finally back on the throne he had gained all those years ago alongside his cousin. Stefan, through leaving troops behind to aid his new ally, had returned to Moldavia after seeing the invasion of Wallachia through. This was a victory worth celebrating after such a long struggle with Moldavia's next-door neighbor. But tragically, it would be a short time of triumph. Before January 1477 came to a close, Vlad and almost every one of Stefan's bodyguards he'd left for his relative had been slaughtered when the Ottomans reinvaded. Some speculate betrayal was what finally took down Stefan's Wallachian cousin, while others believe it to have been a simple casualty of war. Either way, Stefan had supported Vlad with all his efforts in the final year of his life. But now, the voivode of Moldavia was left with no ally beside him, and no clear protege to groom for the job. He did, nevertheless, have a man by the name of Basarab IV, nicknamed Sepalush, and this man would do for the time being. The Ottomans had reinstated Leota in the place of Vlad Dracula, which, much like his reigns before and after Vlad's younger brother Radu, would not last. Stefan would have none such a circumstance, and entered Wallachia once again to oust his former confidant. Successful, Stefan placed the younger Basarab on the throne in what he hoped would be a more permanent rule. The subsequent months showed signs of promise, as peace treaties were signed, relationships, such as that between Stefan and Casimir, were strengthened, and plans for the future were discussed. Unfortunately for Stefan, however, the Ottomans remained an intimidating bunch. Basarab IV, much like the elder of his namesake, made peace with Sultan Mehmed. The Prince of Moldavia was grudgingly forced to follow suit, his contentment with this fact undoubtedly entirely non-existent. His work in Wallachia was again not finished, and he was now running out of options. Stefan attempted to replace yet another failed student, this time with a man by the name of Mircea, who many historians believe to be one of Stefan's own sons. But this task failed. Basarab IV now had Ottoman support, and for the time being, the Moldavians were unable to overpower them. War broke out on Moldavia's battered soil for another period, and the tireless Stefan was forced to accept that peace was still nowhere in his near future.